Africans at home and throughout the diaspora. Unity is strength. We got the power.
Stop the fussing and the fighting. Now's the time to do the right thing.
We need more UNITY. Come.
Stop the fussing and the fighting.
Yeah.
Now's the time to do the right thing.
In the spirit of Umoja, embrace with love.
Let's do it right now.
Yes, that's right. That's right. This is Jamala Rogers, your host of Voices from the Battlefield. And like the song says, we got a lot of work to do. We need to stop the fussing and the fighting. We need to be talking about unity, solidarity. And this is so much the time for us to do that because we are in a world of chaos and confusion, most of it induced by the right wing folks. And this is a good time to remind you, as I always do, that we have a 34 count felon in the White House, a pathological liar, a defender and protector of pedophiles. We now know that he's probably going to be one of the most corrupt, not just politicians, but presidents in modern history. This man has amassed $1.5 billion in 1 year for him and his families. So, and that's why we scrounging around trying to make ends meet at the grocery store, stressing out over health care. This man is building like fake ass, ballrooms with gold all around it. So we are in some different kind of times, y'all. We need to recognize that. But there's been some, and I also don't want us to forget the genocide is still going on in Gaza. The Palestinian people are still under attack. They not in the headlines like they used to be, but that is still happening, y'all. And so we need not forget that. So one of the things that I've been telling y'all all through 2025 is don't give up your voice, don't give up your vote, and don't give up your right to assembly. That means going places. And we see that so evident in Minneapolis when they are fighting like 10 toes down with ICE. And so I think this is an inflection point, and maybe my guest can respond to this. But what's happening when you kill two white people, murder them in cold blood? I mean, the latest one was literally after he was disarmed, was shot in the back in broad daylight, y'all. So this gives you an idea of where this thing is. We can no longer ignore it, and because it's happening in another state, it's coming to a state near you, and if not a state, a city. And so I think the people in Minneapolis are giving us some instructions about how to build the protest. And we hope that people learn from us when we were doing it for the Ferguson uprising, because I think we built an incredible infrastructure to sustain those protests for what became the longest protest in modern history. So I know sometimes when people are looking from the outside in, it looks like it's all spontaneous, but people are planning, they are organizing, they are networking. I heard one Minneapolis activists say that they had trained 100,000 people in the Twin City area about either they were legal observers or they were learning how to participate, because some of them had never been in anything like this before. And that's always a good thing when we're bringing new people into the movement for social justice, for equality, for democracy. And so I've been sometimes tickled by some of the things that they've done, but some of it is pretty creative. I know last week I talked about they're going to places where ICE are housed, some of the hotels, calling them out. And so then the hotel people have to like shut down. We don't want all this drama, so you can't stay here. Those are the kind of things that we still can do, y'all, before this place actually shuts all the way down. So you got to use your ingenuity. The other thing that came surfaced this week is that Some of the white people are putting Mexican flags, bumper stickers on their car. It's called ice fishing, and it's causing the ice people to stop them. This is just to me. I don't. Whoever thought this up it's just ingenious. So they stop white people who then are keeping them from getting to the other things and wasting their time because they're going to be able to prove that they are U.S. citizens. So those are the kind of things that we got to do. Those are the kind of nonviolent creative things that we have to do in a struggle like this. I know some people want to, the folks in Philly have gone to the new Black Panther parties, carrying their guns out. But that could be kind of scary for like our communities. But this is the stuff, the nonviolent stuff that everybody is doing that you will feel safe and comfortable with doing. So kudos to the white people who are putting the Mexican flag bumper stickers on their car, because that carries with it a certain amount of danger as well. But this is a dangerous climate that we were in. I don't know if people saw what happened to Representative Ilhan Omar, some what crazy person, and I don't know if they really had mental health issues, but they sprayed her with something, some unknown substance while she was talking, and it got pretty damn close to her. And it could have been like acid, it could have been anything, it could have been a bullet, really. And they tackled this person and they still trying to figure out what that was. But this is the dangerous climate that has been created by Trump and his MAGA monsters for elected officials who disagree with him. And as you know, Representative Omar has been the brunt of a lot of his vitriol because she's of Somalian descent, and he's talked bad about Somali. He's talked bad about the Somalian community there in Minnesota. So it's not surprising that at some point she would become a target. But hopefully she's okay. She says she is, but I think it was a wake-up call that perhaps she needs to increase her security and maybe not be as accessible. But she is saying she's not backing down. This is the kind of stuff that is to be expected and is to intimidate her and others, and she's undeterred. And I really think from the video that I saw her, that it looked like she was getting ready to go after that dude. She had
Oh,
her
yes.
little fist up. And so, I mean, it's instinctive, and I know I probably would have done the same thing. What, you did what? But luckily they restrained the person, and it's a lesson to be learned for all of us. But yeah, so we got work to do, and it's not just that we stand in solidarity with the folks in Minneapolis. ICE is in most of our communities, maybe not like 10 times that of the Twin City, because they only have 600 police in Minneapolis, and I think they almost have like 500,000 people there. So you got like, I think it's like 3 or 4 thousand ICE agents. So those folks got to be just in a total preoccupation mode there. And I just want you to think about that. 600 police who've been doing the job that they are sworn to do, and now you got agents all over the place doing all kind of stuff in broad daylight, including macing folks with chemical substances, which is unconstitutional. We found that out here in Ferguson, like when they started using that, and we were told that's illegal under the Geneva Convention. So you gotta check that stuff. You gotta know what your rights are. And so, I just admire the tenacity of folks in Minneapolis who were doing this in sub-degree temperatures. It's one thing to be out there with your signs and your chants with in 60, 70, 80 degrees, but when you talk about 10 below, that's a whole nother level of commitment. So hats off to the folks in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, really, for the efforts that they're putting forth, showing us how to do this work, how to protest. Closer to home, I just want to say that we kicked back what's called SB 22, and this was a measure that was that the Missouri Supreme Court struck down, but it was going to, we called it let politicians lie, because it was going to allow the state Secretary of State to be able to use deceptive language on these ballot initiatives, which are already confusing as it is, because sometimes when you want them to vote no, the language makes it seem like you're supposed to vote yes, and people get confused. So this is another effort for us to make the language, clear and concise, and that was obviously a victory for the people. And we thank all those civil rights attorneys and organizations who helped to make that happen. But you should know that it didn't come out of the goodness of their heart. It was like some efforts behind that. So I am so excited about my guest today. Uh, After reading the book, I just had so many questions, so I felt like I had to really focus, be disciplined, and try to ask the most salient questions. But Rosemary, let me make it sure, because I never say your last name. Debussy,
Ndubuizu.
Ndubuizu, and
Ndubuizu.
Ndubuizu,
We're gonna keep
Ndubuizu.
trying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's why I always say just Rosemary. But Rosemary is an author of this book, and it's got a long title, but sometimes you have to do that. And the title is, and we're going to get her to talk about why that title, The Undesirable Many, Black Women and Their Struggles Against Displacement and Housing Insecurity in the Nation's Capital. And I know for some people, they don't think there's any real problems in the DC area just because it is the nation's capital, and they get all of the attention and all of that to make sure it's nice and tidy for the people coming in, the tourists and whatever. But there's an underbelly there that folks don't often get to see. And so one of those is the battlefront around housing. So we're going to get into that. But and when I bring folks who are part of the academy, they got something going on more than just being in ivory towers.
Yes.
Rosemary is an assistant professor at Georgetown University, but her area is public housing policy, and she has been doing that kind of organizing with One DC, and who I've had the privilege of working with over the years. And this is their 20th anniversary, and so I look at public housing, Rosemary, like I look at the prison industrial complex, the organizing. Everybody's not built for that because you have these bureaucracies that feel like you just bumping your head up against a wall. And so it's not built for everybody. So the folks that are in there, I have just the utmost respect for them because every action, it's got to be methodical, it's got to be strategic, and sometimes you only get that one chance. And so I just want to lift up the work of One DC, who has 20 years of making sure people have housing, their rights are respected. But I just want to welcome you to the program because this is your first time and hopefully not the last time that you will be
Ashe.
on Voices from the Battlefield.
Ashe and Ise.
So
Wonderful.
tell me a little bit about the work that you've done with One DC and also why the title,
Mm,
particularly the undesirable many, that part
mhm,
of it.
mhm. Oh, well, first, I want to say thank you so much. Those of you who probably have been longtime listeners already know this, but I wanted to share that at 1DC, many of us call her Mama Jamala because she has been a mother and very much a supportive elder in movement work. And so we're very thankful. I'm very thankful that I get to know you. And I got to know you at 1DC, and I'm very honored that you offered me an opportunity to come talk with you on your radio show. So my story with 1DC started actually randomly through a Google search when I was I'm originally from Inglewood, California, by way of my Nigeria. Both of my parents are from Nigeria, but I was born and raised in LA. And after college, I knew I wanted to be an organizer. I just wanted to do what I thought was required at the time, but for this current moment. So back then, it was 20 years ago, and I wanted to be a part of a group that was kind of like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so I looked online to see what organization was like that in DC, because I also wanted to be in DC. I thought DC was the place where Black politics happens. I
Hmm.
I had the vibe that DC was kind of like a movement space. Um, Clearly because at the time I didn't even know this, but SNCC had its imprints on DC, not only with Marion Barry, but just an ecosystem of SNCC organizers that stayed in DC. And so I found One DC through a Google search. I think I put, DC and SNCC type organizations or something. I can't remember. One DC comes up, I call them, I say, hey, first I asked for a wage job because I was like, hey, I'm unemployed.
I just got out of college.
I need I need to be with my peoples. And so they were like, we don't have a job. I said, my next question was, can I volunteer? I knew that that was supposed to be a place for me to keep providing support. So I ended up getting a job as an coordinator for an all Black girls after school program. And I took a red eye, and my first appointment was with One DC. And that was I want to say in either September or something of 2006. And then in October, since October of that year, I've been involved with One DC in some shape or form. That next year they called me and they said, hey, you still want to do organizing as your paid job? I said, yes. Say when. And luckily they decided that I should join the team. So actually, that was my first entry into even understanding organizing around affordable housing, because that was a job I was given. I was an affordable housing organizer, particularly around public land.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and so I'm low key, I'm just a nerd. I feel like, Mama Jamal, you're probably the same, but I'm a nerd. I always have a book. And so it just became this whole space for me to really kind of discover what it means to do organizing in this work. So I just started to obsess. I started to read about a bunch. One of the first books that actually kind of opened my eyes around affordable housing was Rhonda Williams' book on public housing in Baltimore. And I was like, ooh, it would be I didn't think of it at the time, but I was like, it'd be nice to have a book on DC. And so,
Mm, mm.
you know,
Yeah,
20 years later, life has a
yeah,
way
right.
coming full
Yeah.
circle.
It's never late. It's always on time.
Hmm.
So I wanted to, and then the mini, the undesirable mini. I know it's many. I can understand that, but where did the undesirable part come from?
Yeah. So in my organizing experience, which I should also add after I became a wage organizer and then I went back to grad school, I still kept doing organizing. So I've been a part of One DC relatively consistently since 2006. But one of the things I kept seeing as we were doing organizing around affordable housing is that there's this constant subtext of whether or not you want certain types of tenants. Back in the 80s, it was public housing tenants. Today we may say Section 8. And so to me, the title kind of came to my mind when I was thinking about just understanding the long history of social welfare politics through a race and gendered lens. And if we look at it through the lens of Black women and how Black women have made historical demands on support for affordable housing, for good paying jobs, for, quality affordable health care, there's always been this kind of public backlash or at least heightened suspicion. And so to me, the undesirable many is an attempt to try to capture the fact that Black women generally are kind of what we would consider the canary in the coal mine, that we tend to be demonized first, and then that actually provides the pathway for a country to then demonize many of us. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with my title is to signal that the undesirable, it's always a subpopulation, but if you really look closely, it's usually a cover. And it ends up being transformed. So the undesirable is never truly the people that you think are like, you may have your own subconscious stereotypes like, oh, yeah, so and so who doesn't seem to throw their trash out. You may think,
Hmm,
but
hmm, hmm.
in popular and political practice, it's actually a little bit different. So oftentimes it becomes a very malleable category. And so now we're experiencing that now with the undesirable many, not only being public housing residents, Section 8,
Mm-hmm.
or unhoused people. It is now, if you're an academic, if you say you're a leftist, if you say you are,
Mm-hmm.
the undesirable many
Yeah,
means it's most of
right.
us if you
No.
are anti a particular authoritarian position.
Yeah. So one of the things I think the book does extremely well is to lift up the racial, class, and gendered implications of housing. And I know people don't normally see that or think that they see it. They think it's all like about poor people. But even when I look at the first big public housing here, it was for white folks. It was like post-war white folks, and so they were really nice, yada yada. But so this whole thing of like class, race, and gender is really important to make those interconnections, and that book does it really well. I'm thinking of when you say we talk about the undesirables, the leaders that come forward in public housing, I think have a certain persona. And certainly when I read about a Kimmy Gray, I do think about a Bertha Gilkey, because
Yeah,
these women have powerful presences.
absolutely.
They are, they are. I know Bertha Gilkey had a commanding presence when she came in the room and talked. People like, listened. It's like she knows what she's talking about. It's such confidence. So to me, I think you almost have to have those kind of leaders in public housing because, this is a place where we people are not going to be respected. You got to be willing, and people need to see that you'll stand up, fight for your rights, but you will also fight for other people's rights. And so that to me is indicative of a leader. And certainly Kimmy Gray, you know, positioned herself in that way. I'm glad to see that she didn't have the same demise that our housing rights Shiro had, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But to talk about like who steps forward in these spaces to lead such whew, you know, formidable foe as, housing and urban development,
Yeah.
the arm of the government, like, who would want that? Who thinks that they are capable of that? And
Mm,
so people like Kimi Gray who step forward and other people, whether it be in Chicago, Baltimore, it seems like it's the same type of woman.
absolutely. And that's an excellent insight from my work. I found that quite true. Like there's this mighty few, and they tend to have these personality traits. Like one is they're highly charismatic, like they can shapeshift a room in terms of energy and attention. Two, they're also really they're like nodes in the community. Like they're the other mothers in some ways. Like they are either connected to a community group that's giving out food, or like Kimmy Gray, she was the kind of like an after school coordinator, or essentially she was a youth group or youth
Hmm.
services
Hmm.
supporter, right?
Hmm.
So young people respect them. They are someone that is seen as a resource. And then the other one is that they actually believe that it's important to actually be a welfare distributor. That's the ironic part of how many of them got, a few of them, at least in the 80s, got implicated in some of the neoliberal politics that were happening at HUD in the federal government with the Reagan administration. But I thought it was really powerful because it was really, really telling in the 60s and the late 60s when you started to see the first wave of Black women-led tenant activism, and you see these Black women, interestingly enough, being the stewards of their homes, but also the vanguard of the community defense around deeply affordable housing, that they wanted to have quality affordable housing through public housing, or even if it was at the time, it was called scattered housing, but essentially the precursor to what we know as vouchers. And so having Black women be vanguards and community defenders, it requires that they had to have a stake in the community. And I thought that was really impressive.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reminded me when I was started to read that we just Organization for Black Struggle just finished 45-year commemorative edition, And one of the groups of people that we called out right up front was the women tenant organizers that took us under their wing back in the 70s,
Mm.
because they were so powerful. Again, you just attracted to them, and then you see what they do. You're like, wow, I want to know how to do it like they do it. And we had already been in some of those spaces organizing against police brutality, and so there was this connection of working with them. And so people like Loretta Hall, Gene King, like a lot of the folks that
Dean
people
King,
knew
yes.
that have since passed. These were the same ones that led and organized the infamous rent strike here. So
Yes.
these are women that were so powerful in their presence, in their tactics, and their know-how. And I think many people then and even now probably underestimate these women. Oh, they're uneducated. What do they know about the system? But they knew a lot about the system, and what they didn't know, they learned pretty quickly. And so yeah, it's just I have a special place in my heart for the women who organize other tenants in public housing. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the why it was necessary, since we're talking about Black women, for you to write this book through a feminist lens.
Mm.
Why was that important?
Oh, it's an excellent question. Part of that was just through political struggle, learning that when we're in these rooms. So, at One DC, one of the campaigns I write about in the introduction of the book is a campaign called Parcel 42. It was around a public piece of land. So at One DC, and I'm sure at Organization for Black Struggle and many other groups, we believe that public land should be used for public good. And so if the public good right now is affordable housing, you build affordable housing, and you build a housing that's truly affordable, not affordable in the ways that a lot of wealthier developers would prefer. And so on that particular piece of land, Parcel 42, we were in negotiations with the mayor to actually enforce a community benefits agreement, which we know through struggle and experience that community benefits agreements are only as good as they are enforced. So
Mm-hmm.
we had to have a very strong enforcement campaign. And so at the time, we were meeting with the mayor, who at that time was Mayor Fenty, who is now kind of, been absconded away to California since he lost, which we are happy that we were
Right, right,
helped to
right.
create the political climate to say, get out.
Mm-hmm.
And in that meeting, we were very clear that we needed to build deeply affordable housing on that site. And in the following meetings that we had with the Fenty's administration, they started to get cold feet. And essentially, they started to insist that perhaps maybe we should not be having deeply affordable housing. This is kind of like in the mid 2000s, so like 2007, 2008, or late 2000s, excuse me. And so they were making comments. They were saying things like, we don't want to concentrate certain types of people. We've learned our lesson. And to me, it was a clear jab at Black women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so to not talk about gender seemed like it was a clear mistake. And I don't like unstrategic mistakes. And
Right,
so
right.
I said it was absolutely imperative we need to talk about gender. And so when I went back to school and I started studying the history more closely, and then coming back and still doing the organizing, I saw gender everywhere in housing policy. And I also see it in national policy. If you want to chat about that, we
Mm-hmm.
could talk about that too, because that's partly why we're having this current administration
Mm-hmm.
and what
Mm-hmm.
it's doing. But using gender as a way to push conservative policy or austerity policies is very core. So using Black women over again is using Black women both as a decoy, but also as like a proxy for enforcing austerity policy. So in this context with Parcel 42, they were using Black women to say, well, we actually don't think we should be building deeply affordable housing. But then they would also use Black women to say, well, we need to enforce more stringent welfare reform. So then suddenly you have rapid rehousing related to Black women having to get assistance for only 2 years and then having to pay market rate rent because the assumption is you should have housing, which is very, very
Right.
similar to what Trump administration is doing right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so using Black women, to me, gender made sense. So then by offering Black feminist materialism, my hope is that we put gender in its rightful place, at least analytically and politically, so we understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely did that in my work with the prison industrial complex, and I remember being in the space. This has been some years ago, and I think we were in a workshop and we were talking about the work that we're doing, and I said part of my feminist uh, work was the prison industrial complex, and I remember one sister saying that's not like feminist work, and I'm like, huh?
Absolutely.
And so I had to give her a little education about the fact that through the decades of my working, I had never worked with a man. I'm serious. These were the sisters of folks incarcerated, the wives or partners of women incarcerated, the mothers. They were all women, Rosemary. So
Absolutely.
how are you not going to tell me this is gendered, a gendered issue?
Yeah.
So I think there was a little bit of a pause, and everybody in the room was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. So I just think that sometimes we look at the whole feminist perspective in a very narrow way, and mainly it gets academic, in an academic way, like you study in these books. Well, what the hell is the study of books if you can't make it apply to the reality of women on the ground? And so I thought doing that was a very powerful piece to actually center Black women, because that's who has been the target. And so if you don't do that, then women and other folks don't understand the power of what's going on, and then we can't really support that issue in a real way. I think about you mentioned welfare reform, which to me, those two are so intertwined, like the whole housing issue. Um, and welfare reform. And we know that, for example, every time welfare reform came up, people were able to conjure up in their heads this whole false narrative about the welfare queen. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask you about how these narratives play in with policymakers, but also with the general public, including Black people, because I can't tell you
Mm.
how many Black folks would say, "Oh, that's a shame. They rip it. And that's not fair." And I'm thinking, whatever these women are getting, that little bit of stuff they ain't near what these folks are robbing us of. So, like, keep your eyes on the prize. This woman getting like
Absolutely.
$500 and she can buy her a car, or now she can afford a air conditioner. Because
Yeah.
for years people didn't know you couldn't have an air conditioner in public housing.
Oh,
That was
yes.
a struggle. That
Yeah.
was a fight. So this woman, this welfare queen, has amassed, was created enough to do some piecing together stuff to now have a real affordable income, a real livable wage,
Yeah.
and so she got castigated for that. So when even now this whole welfare thing comes up with people, you know, uh, ripping the system off. And look how much these people are ripping. I mean, into the not in the millions anymore. It's in the billions that they ripping us off. And we're talking about somebody that's getting $200 in food stamps monthly when they need probably 800.
Absolutely.
So this narrative that has helped create some of the negative uh, public policies around housing.
Mm.
What's been the impact of that?
Mm. So many. I wanted to answer your question fully, so I wanted to make sure that I shared with your already I'm sure many of your educated listeners already know some of this, but I thought it was important to emphasize how pop culture shapes politics. And so the welfare queen itself, and some of your listeners probably already have heard about this, but back in the 60s, there was I want to say it was a Southern country pop song, Welfare Cadillac, um, that was released. And it was actually about a man. It was a man who had who was able to use the government funds to buy a Cadillac to try to woo women. I think it came out, I want to say like either late 1960s or early 1970. Reagan, who we all know, comes in, he's trying to run again for president, and he's trying to be an actor turned politician. And so he picks up the story that's happening in Chicago, where it's one of the few highly publicized court cases around welfare fraud. This only comes after having a decade almost of publicized congressional hearings where we had some Southern Democrats in alliance with Republicans who were trying to highlight the quote unquote access or the instances of what they thought were welfare fraud. So these are women like in DC, who are being exposed for quote unquote having a man house, right? Because that was the assumption that a lot of these primarily white men had about Black women, assuming that they were trying to dodge the system or cheat the system by having a man who's supposed to pay for the household, um, but still getting resources. So when Reagan comes into play, it was, I think, in 1976, he picks up on this court case that's happening in Chicago. The sister named Linda Taylor, who actually is kind of racially ambiguous by contemporary standards. I'm sure some folks would be like, all right, well, they would give the raised eyebrow if they were trying to assess her racial background, but racial. And she was accused of stealing about like $8,000 at the time. She was a very dynamic figure, complicated as well, which we all are. But in the racial lens, you're either good or bad, especially for Black folks.
Right, especially for Black women.
Black women, exactly. Thank you. Thank you. And so she is accused of taking about 8,000, which I think in this current moment would probably be around $55,000. That much. Meanwhile, you have welfare that's subsidizing the wealthy in the billions, right? And so she is accused of, pillaging, stealing, and it's just outrageous. Reagan then says, well, she's a welfare queen. And essentially, you have this intersection between pop culture, so music, helping to popularize this idea that welfare itself is a bad thing and that it's benefiting the wrong people. And then you have a politician who's strategically enough trying to link himself to an existing case, very similar to how we're doing it now, right? Somalia, and in Minnesota, and this man in the White House. And so you have Reagan successfully popularizing welfare queen without even mentioning Linda Taylor in the particulars of that case. And it becomes a convenient scapegoat because that's one of the things that welfare reform discourse has done. Like, it's been a way for people to actually say they've been able to sidestep the economic inequalities that are happening, that are impacting everyone, to then scapegoat and blame a certain group of people. So in one of my classes, I oftentimes say, we have a historical problem of misnaming labor problems as racial ones, but I would also add we have a historical problem of misnaming those labor problems not only as racial, but also gendered ones. So we're constantly using Black women to scapegoat these broader labor that are happening because we have inequality between the wealthy and the working class, right? So as a consequence of this discourse of welfare reform, it was far easier. Once Reagan got in his first term, his first year, he was able to cut HUD budget by 60%, essentially stop producing public housing at all, dramatically reshifting it to what we call vouchers now. And then the consequence of that was 10 years later, we had a Democrat from the South come into office again and double down on this idea that there.
Would you be talking about the first Black president?
That's what they said, but not mine. Not mine. That's what they said back then.
Yeah,
and
I
so,
couldn't believe that. Yeah.
He was able to pass this massive reform bill that not only impacted welfare, like TANF, what we consider, or it turned into TANF, but it was back then AIDS for families with dependent children, and it turned into TANF, which essentially is workfare. You have to, you can only get it for 60 months. But it was also public housing reform. That's where we got Hope 6 on steroids. And since the 90s, we've lost over 250,000 public housing units. I think now we're down to under 1 million. So that's over 1 million we've lost in the last 40 years. We've shifted to vouchers, but the vouchers are not replacing en masse the number of units we've lost due to demolition. And so it's unsurprising that we're seeing unaffordability go up at the same time as we're seeing the number of unhoused people go up, which includes single mothers with children. And so the consequences have been quite dire, but unfortunately, many of us were raised in a moment where we were told that those people were undeserving. We were constantly being bombarded with popular culture messages of the single Black mother who can't take care of his, can't raise herself and can't take care of those kids. Either was strung out on crack. It was all types of like horrific, what I would call poverty porn, and other people would call it that, where they were constantly displaying the worst to suggest that that was the norm.
Right.
And not talking about how the lack of welfare, the lack of actual guaranteed employment that actually provided healthcare benefits, that provided living wage supports, were also equally absent as well.
Yeah. I think about you talk about the number of housing, public housing, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you is the term public housing,
Mhm.
is it really real anymore? Because I think people, because they don't see high rises, they think that, oh, the housing issue has been resolved, and now people get to live in nice homes with the vouchers. Um, and I know that the amount of public housing in terms of projects that we traditionally know from the 60s and 70s are gone. Um, and that it seems like the battlefronts now are unhoused and homeless people, getting them housed, the whole affordable housing thing, and then it's the tenants' rights, whether you're in public housing or not. That it seems to have shifted. Is that your assessment as well?
Yeah, I mean, part of the terrain of public housing has changed so drastically. So because we're more dispersed, we have vouchers, there still is. So we're probably fighting affordable housing on a private within the private market. So that tends to mean like housing code enforcement, things like that, with landlords. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there still are pockets of particularly project-based Section 8, because as public housing has lost so much support and funding, political support and funding, there's been a shift within HUD since at least since the Obama era, so since the 2010s, to move public housing to what they call rental assistance, so project-based Section 8. So we're seeing more and more project-based Section 8 that now is becoming the frontline defense, because in those arrangements, oftentimes landlords have an opt-out. So they have an affordability covenant that can end. And so we're seeing, unless it's a nonprofit that's willing to extend, or there's some covenant that is over generations. So we're seeing increasing attention is being paid towards project-based Section 8. So at 1DC, that's been our historical tendency, is to support project-based Section 8 in addition to public housing. And that introduces a whole slew of new characters, right? So different landlords having to compete with community neighbors who are worried that Section 8 renters are bringing down the value of their property. So whereas with public housing, you oftentimes were able to just deal with a housing authority or state officials. Now you have to deal with more complex ecosystem, I think, of
Mm.
actors. Um, but we still do have public housing. It's just fewer and unfortunately
Mm-hmm.
highly disinvested.
Right, right. You know, I think about you. There's a chapter in the book that talks about owning the plantation, and
Yes,
I said, "Oh, that's so Rosemary." I know she came up with that, but it was Kimmy Gray that came up
just
with that
kidding.
because she recognized the housing projects as a plantation, and she said, "If we're gonna live here, we need to own it."
Might as
And
well.
so, and then you talk about in that chapter the shift from management to ownership.
Yes.
And that was so controversial, but I think when you start to look at how the disinvestment was going, it was almost used to help push that disinvestment. And so if you would talk a bit about, because you brought in, some of the experiences with our own
Yeah.
housing projects here in St. Louis, particularly Bertha Gilkey, who was one of the national voices for tenant ownership. And it was very controversial because people were trying to figure out, the people who are promoting this, are they pawns of the system, pawns of HUD, or are they getting paid to be complicitors? And so for many, the jury was still out, but it actually did have a negative effect because there was no way that people could sustain ownership when there was all this disinvestment going on. You got this big old high rise, and all of a sudden you don't even have money for trash, and so people are trying to pick up trash on a volunteer basis. I mean, it was a hot mess.
It was.
So, but you talked about the fact that the 60% cut in HUD when
Yeah.
uh, Nixon came on, and it just went downhill from there.
Yeah.
Why would people not think? And when I'm saying people, like some of the women who thought this was going to be a good idea for the constituents that they were serving, uh, why was that just, it was seemed like the shiny thing that, yeah, that seems like something we want to own, as
Mm.
opposed to, is this a trick, and are we going to be left holding the bag when all this stuff ends? What do you think was the thinking around that?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I grappled with a lot of that in chapter 4. Part of it was, so as you mentioned, um, Bertha Gilkey, Kimmy Gray, there's about 4 Black women who rise to national prominence, in part because of this white guy. I don't know if you remember Jack Kemp. Do you remember
Oh,
Jack Kemp?
sure.
Yeah.
Jack Kemp used to be back and forth in St. Louis all the time. Yes.
Exactly. Coming to probably
Hmm.
meet Miss Gilkey.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so Jack Kemp was this former athlete, former football player turned politician. Again, the intersections between pop culture and politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he was a mouthpiece for the Heritage Foundation. I'm sure your listeners already know about the Mandate for America and Project 25. So Mandate for America is the Heritage Foundation. They do this annual piece essentially, generally every year, where they list their priorities, particularly for new administrations, but and the Republican administration. So the Mandate for America was first issued that year. Reagan then implements most of those changes. Jack Kemp ends up becoming a Congress-based spokesperson for the Heritage Foundation. And so HUD, other than gutting HUD, which was the primary focus of most conservatives at the time, Jack Kemp thought it was best for him for the Republicans to promote what I would call neoliberal populism, like trying to make the idea of privatizing housing and deregulating housing policies as a popular endeavor. Very similar to how Trump currently does with his narratives of privatization. And what ends up happening is Jack Kemp develops these unique relationships with Black women in public housing because of Black neoconservatives, right? So Black
And
neoconservatives.
I love the way you did that in the book, how you connected all of that, man. That
Mhm.
was wow. I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa.
And I partly did it because in the contemporary discussion, people tend to ignore that there was this Black neoconservatives were the ones who
Let
brokered
me
that
just
relationship.
interrupt you, Rosemary, because I think there need to be a whole thing written about the role of St. Louis in terms of the whole public housing struggle, because we had Alfonso Jackson here.
Oh, yeah.
Alfonso Jackson was a Bush appointee who
Yes.
started off with being the executive director of the Housing Authority. He
Yep.
did so good at messing that up, they made him secretary of HUD. So
Yep.
he had a direct role in all that you're talking about. And then we had the failed housing project of Pruitt Igoe.
Yep.
So this is the centerpiece for all what's ugly and wrong with public housing was right
Absolutely.
here in St. Louis. And the
Absolutely.
neocons were leading it.
Absolutely. And it became such a salient point for the Black neocons because it provided them with a platform of legitimacy. They're like, we have a base of people who we can then lift up and then test out these policies on. In part, because public housing residents were politically desperate. For over almost 2 decades, they were dealing with disinvestment. And so I think women, particularly women like Kimmy Gray and Miss Bertha Gilkey, they thought that they perhaps could have a strategic alliance. And I think perhaps maybe they thought they had more power than they did. So what I tried to do was highlight how in someone like Kimmy Gray, who was promoting tenant ownership or public housing ownership as a strategy for Black people, Black tenants, essentially to build wealth, is essentially Black women in the South created the idea, and they helped to promote it at the national level. The problem is they did it in a time where people did not have their same political interests. So the neocons, Jack Kemp, they were far more interested in trying to use public housing as a means to reduce the federal responsibility in terms of the welfare state. And so Kimmy Gray and others are trying to say, well, actually, this is a way for us to sustain the welfare state, but we have more autonomy over how it happens, right? So getting rid of the, man in the house rules, but then replacing them with supportive welfare supports. That's more of Kimmy Gray's perspective. But that's not what the Republicans wanted. So they used Black women, again, as a proxy to then talk about the ways in which the Black public housing family is dysfunctional. So they would use Black neocons as well to also promote these negative stereotypes. So saying things like, well, actually, Kimmy Gray, what's great about her is that she disciplines the poor. She disciplines them so well that they no longer watch soap operas during the day. They're getting a job. Now, if
Yeah.
Jack Kemp said that, we would all be up in arms. But Black neocons were so willing to do so, very similar to how Ben Carson is doing so, right? And how, Alfonso Jackson did so. So providing this avenue for Black women helped to provide this avenue for these Republicans to then say very demonizing things through association and reference, right? Indirect reference. So they're not talking about Kimmy Gray specifically, but they're talking about the rest of the public housing residents that way. And you see that through their selective funding priorities. So if you were public housing tenants who were trying to push tenant management or tenant ownership, you would actually get access sometimes to more funding, but the rest of the communities weren't. They were actually getting access to more police oversight and disinvestment.
And then when in the book, it talks about how, like Kimmy Gray, some of the where she was getting, like you said, resources, but other folks weren't, and they started to say, well, wait a minute, what about us? And I'm wondering, was that intentional pitting those communities against one another?
And it's hard to tell from the existing archives. My suspicion is yes, because it creates the pathway for then 10 years later to then say, well, no one else is getting that amount of funding, so why should you?
When everybody should have been getting that level of funding.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
It was so revealing in so many ways. It made me try to go back. The Organization for Black Struggle, housing was not one of our pillars, but often we got drawn into it, and so we understood it, but we weren't on the front lines. And so, you hardly hear of most of those leaders have since made their transition, but I don't know that anybody has really tried to capture the legacy. Now, last year there was an exhibit that one of the students at WashU had done,
Mhm.
and it dealt with all the women that were part of the rent strike. It had photos and all
Excellent.
kind, really nicely done, but it was poorly publicized, and it was in a part of the WashU campus that it was going to be hard to get to unless you knew the campus. And I'm thinking, wow, what a missed opportunity for us to understand what these women did and what their sacrifices were. And I'm just thinking that, the book that you've done on housing in DC lifts that up. But again, I'm hoping that that's inspiration for others to really talk about housing, because when the government started to get out of the public housing business, that wasn't the only social services that they were trying to get out of. So when we come to 2026 and we see that they're crying like there's no money here, no money there, they've had systematically reduce those budgets so that they could pay for defense, so they could pay for the cuts for the billionaires. And we really, it was so insidious that we really didn't see it or pay attention. All we know is that we poor and we don't know why we poor. And we're working real hard, Rosemary, so we won't be poor. But it just seems like we're on a one of those like wheels, and people don't
Absolutely.
understand it. And so I think this was really insightful for laying out like how it happened, why it happened, and even some of the things that we could do now, because you talk about the kind, if people are going to advocate for that, they have to really be advocating for the institutional, cultural, and structural changes that need to be done. And that's a whole nother ball game, particularly with the regime that we have now. So
Absolutely.
in the few minutes that we have left, talk about the role of housing. Maybe not so much public housing, but how do we get housing, affordable housing, right now, given all that we know that they are not interested in poor folks, not particularly housing, because housing is expensive.
Absolutely.
And I look at in St. Louis where we just had a devastating tornado that hit the north side, which is predominantly black, which was already in decay and had not been rebuilt over the decades. And so people have gotten, it's been normalized that you're not going to get housing. And I think that is such an insidious conclusion for us to draw.
I agree. One of the things I really enjoyed about writing my book is that I talked about the financialization of housing. So I put public housing and project-based housing within the broader um, political economy of housing within the United States. And since the 1960s, but definitely since the 1970s, since we started to essentially sell mortgages and sell housing as a global commodity, we have
Mm,
systematically reduced affordability because now we're competing everywhere is competing to um, buy a stake in housing here. So yes, Trump politicizes China buying, mortgage-backed subsidies, but you would also talk about the private equity firms that are buying a ton of housing. So single-family homes are dramatically being impacted, particularly in markets like in the Sun Belt area. Um, and so you have folks who are fighting to just maintain access to housing, generally. That has a ripple effect with renters, right? Because we don't necessarily have the money to be able to put the down payment. So we're stuck in a rental
hmm
market where we're now a
hmm
captured market in a lot of these tight rental areas. So DC, New York, St. Louis, all these places that have intense economic activity. We're struggling to pay the bills because we now know we are essentially held captive by investors who see that they can easily sell that housing to people who can pay cash for it. And we
hmm
saw this, we all felt this during COVID. This administration, and to be honest, the previous administrations have failed to adequately deal with this. So that means not only controlling who can buy housing, but controlling the price of housing itself. So that means getting back to things like rent control. In the 70s,
hmm
that was something we had a universal claim to and demand, and many cities were able to reach it. But unfortunately, the finance sector, in particular, in conjunction with real estate, said no, hell no, and started to systematically attack by getting an alliance with, guess who? These Republican administrations
Right.
systematically undermined it. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party, because they often are historically spineless, have refused to actually support policies that ensure that there is some rent stabilization and price controls so that housing can't just be bought by those who have the most money, that it has to be a need and a good that we keep in and we control access to it.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there, but I can assure you, I got a list of questions that I didn't even touch, Rosemary.
Well,
I swear I didn't even touch it. So this is the book. This
Very
is the
honored.
book right here. You can't go wrong with reading it. You're going to learn a lot. But it's interesting that the announcements that I'm going to make are all connected with this topic, and who knew? So on February 6th, and we've had Ben Phillips on this show. Ben Phillips was his family lived in public housing, Pruitt-Igoe to be specific. They were sprayed with chemicals during the 50s. And now all those folks got cancer. They're dying at unprecedented rates. And when they tried to find out what the chemical was, they were told that that cannot be disclosed because it was the national security. So there is a documentary called Target St. Louis that's going to be shown at the First Unitarian Church. Now, this is not the church. This is not the first time they've shown it, but they need to continue to show it to remind us what has happened. Target St. Louis, February 6th, First Unitarian Church at 6:45 p.m. Then on February 18th, I will be a speaker on Team 4. And most people remember that Team 4 was a reiteration of the whole Negro removal plan. That came out in the 70s, and I was a part of beating that back. I'm going to talk about that. And then on February the 27th, two young organizations have collaborated on buying a building in Northside St. Louis. And y'all don't know what that means for me, because that is a mandate that our elders told us when we were coming of age as young activists in the 70s. And we bought a building in 1973, the Rowan Community Center. So here these two young organizations have put together not just a few $1,000s, but this is a multi-million-dollar facility called Northside Movement Center. And they strategically and intentionally put it in the north side. So, it's going to be an inspiration. It's going to be a beacon of hope for those folks over there. So the open house, the ribbon cutting, is going to be the 27th at 3:30. And I hope you all will join me. I am one of the honorary co-chairs. And so I just feel so, yeah, I feel like this, Rosemary, the way I felt about the Worker Center in D.C. that the one D.C. has. I mean, when you have an institution that's going to be available to our people, it's I'm just beside myself. So I want to thank you again. Tell people where they can get this. Where can
They
they
can
get
get the
this
book.
beautiful book?
So the University of North Carolina Press, you can get it online. One DC, we're also going to have a celebratory event. So if you're in DC, February the 28th at 4 p.m., you can also
Ah,
get access to the book that way.
okay.
But easily you can
Oh,
get it on UNC Press.
okay. Yeah, it is worth buying, worth reading. It's worth making sure that it's part of your go-to book on housing. This is Jamala Rogers, and I will see you. I hope to see you. I expect to see you on the battlefield. Thank you for listening. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, Rosemary, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Appreciate it.
right.
We've got to do it right. Stop the fussing and the fighting. Right now, right now. Let's do it right now. We don't need to fuss and fight. We've got to do it. We got to get it right. We got to get it right. Let's do it right now. We don't need to fuss and fight. We've got to do it right. Stop the fussing and the fighting. It cries for freedom. Let's do it right now. We don't need to fuss and fight. We got to do it.